Hey everybody, welcome back to Tim Travels. I'm your host Terry, coming to you from my back porch. So I think these last few videos they'll be called the Back Porch series from the channel. So number of interesting things going on in trucking right now, and a lot of them have to do with the federal government. And I wanted to talk about some of them and maybe demystify it, especially for newer drivers, and kind of tamp down expectations, right? So the first thing that I came across, and I've talked about this before, but I saw this metric from the federal DOT saying that they had taken off like local authorities had taken like 3,300 drivers, put them out of service because they didn't have the required English proficiency. And I read that and it's like it's a sound bite, or it's a piece of information that people probably are like, oh yeah, they're doing something about all these people that can't speak English. But when a driver's put out of service, like, what does that mean? Do they sit at a way station until they learn enough English to leave? I mean, I feel like they're put out of service, but then somebody else just drives the truck. In other words, as I've said before, there's no penalty on the trucking company or the shipper or the receiver. Anybody that's like got any money, there's no penalty on them for that enforcement action. And honestly, once you're put out of service, you're like, oh, I won't drive then, or whatever you say. Well, in a lot of these trucks, there's another driver. They just drive. And I'm sure that when somebody gets down the road, the guy that was put out of service is back behind the wheel. So I think very little of these enforcement efforts. The other thing that the feds did is the FMCSA passed a rule, and they used like emergency authority to do it, which I don't necessarily think they abuse that emergency authority. Sometimes governmental agencies do abuse it, but what they said is states can't issue licenses to non-domiciled drivers anymore. But here's the problem. If states that were issuing these licenses, and there's a handful of them, right? Like there's not a lot of non-domiciled drivers coming out of South Dakota. It's Washington, California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois. And in other words, states where there has been, in some cases, a history of bribery to get CDLs, people, just buying CDLs, which I guess is the same thing as bribery. And so we know from a long history, from criminal cases, all that stuff, that these states, I mean, in some ways, probably shouldn't be allowed to issue CDLs. The problem is that the federal government doesn't want to federalize it. And there's so many things left to the states that it's really hard to get a common standard for stuff like CDL licenses, stuff like charities, for example. And it runs the gamut. And so even though they're saying, oh, you shouldn't have been issuing these CDLs to non-domiciled persons, they're not doing anything about the CDLs that have already been issued. Because if it's wrong to do it now, then it probably was wrong to do it to begin with. Although I don't think, in terms of law, it was. Now, I'm not saying, when you discover something's wrong, you don't do something about it. But imagine, if you will, that somebody realized, for example, that we had imported, I don't know, let's let's pick something. We had imported green beans that were really poisonous. Like they weren't actually green beans, they just looked like green beans and they were poisonous. Well, the government would say, okay, well, we're not going to let any more of those things that look like green beans come in on any ship or any plane. We're going to stop them at the border. But guess what? They'd also go back and say, yeah, we're pulling all of that stuff in. We're going to get all of it off the shelves. We're going to do something about what already happened. So I feel like every single state that issued licenses to non-domiciled drivers, they know exactly who these people are. And if they're not like rescinding their licenses, then I kind of think that's a problem. But who am I to say? Couple other things that have happened recently in the trucking industry, and some people talk about this a lot, but I noticed the EPA kind of changed things on the DEF systems. And I kind of told this story before about having a DEF system that wasn't, I had derated to 55 miles an hour, and it didn't, I took it to a shop, Trans-Tech Freightliner in Hagerstown, Maryland, and they didn't fix it correctly. Because a few days after I left, I had even bigger problems. But this time I was out in Kansas. It was New Year's Eve. I derated to 5 miles an hour with a load on my back. Had to get towed into Wichita. Had to get the load repowered, and spent like 5 days in Wichita for the Freightliner dealership there to fix the problem correctly. But so what the changes that EPA is making, and I think this starts with the 2027 model year, and this will also apply to like tractors, anything that uses DEF, any commercial application that uses DEF, it'll apply to. But what they're saying is now, if there's a problem with the system, it'll go to, there'll be a 15% reduction. And like I said, there's a lot of videos out about this already, because this is kind of almost old news, but I thought I would mention it. A 15% reduction in power, and that'll stay at 15% for 650 miles or 100 hours. So you'll get, and in my case, I would have just taken the load. I was going to New Mexico. I would have just taken that load, gone to New Mexico, and then gone to a shop. I would have gotten that load delivered, and it was going to Los Lunas, so I'm sure it was going to Walmart. I picked it up at a meat packer in Monmouth, Illinois. So I would have just finished my delivery because I was within 650 miles, I think. But after that, it goes to a 30% reduction in power. But even at 30% reduction in power, excuse me, unless you're climbing mountains and you're loaded with like 40,000 pounds, 30% on, pretty flat terrain is not going to be that big of a deal, because you're probably not running, you're probably running at 50% anyway. So it'll derate to 70%, and that'll go for 4,200 miles, or another 80 hours, which seems weird to me, and maybe I'm misinterpreting this. And then it'll go, and I don't know anybody's going to want to do this, but once that passes, it'll go to 25 miles an hour for 8,400 miles or 160 hours. And then after that, it'll go to 5 miles an hour for 4 hours. But here's the interesting thing. This really would have benefited me, because I could have just gone at 15% reduction in power, gotten from, Emporia, Kansas out to Los Lunas, not a ton of mountains between those two places. Some hills certainly, but nothing, no steep climbs, because I take it back. there is a set of mountains to the east, where Sandia Peak is, to the east of Albuquerque. So I would have had to get over those, but I still think I would have been able to do it, and then get down in the valley there. That's the Rio Grande Valley, I think, and go to Los Lunas and deliver, and then get to, you know, a Freightliner dealership in Albuquerque and say, hey, fix my system. But here's the rub with this. Here's what I see as the problem. I think that there are going to be trucks that and you know, it will also allow you to do this when you don't have any DEF in your tank. I think there are going to be people that routinely run out of DEF. And you know, you ever think about why are there 2.5 gallon empty DEF containers at the pumps like a Love's, where they have, you know, DEF with a hose? I don't know, do these people not have accounts that they can buy the DEF at the pump? I don't really know what the issue is. But anyway, you know, I feel like there are going to be people that run out of DEF and they're just like, yeah, just keep driving, we're good, you know? But really what's going to happen is they're going to be doing damage to the overall system. And when they finally do have to get something repaired, it's going to be significantly more expensive. You know, if your DPF is like super clogged and has to be baked, that you're going to be shut down for several days. Like I had a DPF that needed to be baked, and baking is what they do. It's super hot oven, and it basically solidifies stuff in the filter in order that they can kind of like turn it into something that'll fall out, like dust or chunks or whatever. And I don't pretend to know the whole thing, but the interesting thing about it is it wouldn't surprise me that people harm their own, you know, diesel exhaust systems, because this rule is in place when it finally comes out and it's applied to vehicles. So I don't, you know, it's definitely not something where you could still just ignore it. But I could see where it would help people. You know, it's nice to just get that load off your back and not have to repower it, or not have to have a service failure because of you know. And really in my situation, it was like I had a couple of problems. One is my DEF pump, there was a problem with it. But the first dealership, all they did was change a soot sensor and it cleared an alarm, and they were just like, oh, we're good to go now. We weren't, you know. It fixed it. It was like fixing a symptom, but not really understanding what the entire problem was. And you know, I'm still unhappy about that, but just because they could have done a better job, you know. And I know it's just kind of par for the course. So that's that. Another thing, so that was the EPA. Another thing the FMCSA is doing right now is they're conducting a trial of expanded options for hours of service. And they're running this trial with between 500 and 600 drivers. And really what it's going to do is give more options to split your sleeper. So right now, or before this trial, actually still right now, you could do an 8-2 split. You could do a 7-3 split. You could do a 7.5, you know, 2.5 split. But 7 is the most time, or how do I want to put it? 3 hours is the shortest. Like, I'm struggling. It's the longest break you could take on the short side, if that makes sense. Now you could do an 8 hour, and then on the back end you just have to do 2 hours. And the big side of it, so the 8 side or the 7 side, has to be in the sleeper berth. So you could be in an off-duty status for the short part, but the back part you have to do at least 7 hours in the sleeper. But the two numbers, the break and the sleeper berth, have to aggregate to 10 hours. Well, and by the way, a lot of people get hung up on that. They're like, oh, I was off duty for 3 hours, and then maybe they're PCing or they put themselves off duty, but it has to be in the sleeper berth. And the problem with that is I've done a split sleeper, but then I was actually out of the truck, but I had to leave myself in the sleeper berth so I didn't get a violation. Now, I've had people say, oh, that wouldn't happen. But I had a time where I had split my sleeper and I did over 10 hours, but I was just off duty, and I got a violation. So getting the large part in sleeper berth status is imperative. But here's what they're doing with this new test. They're offering the option to go to like a 6-4 split or even a 5-5 split. Now, that's kind of interesting because, excuse me, I had this is last fall. I was actually running dry van at Bowman, and I had split my sleeper, but I had to still do like, I think 8 hours and I called dispatch, talked to a night guy, and he was like, oh, you could do a 5-5 split. And I'm like, nah, that's not a thing. But here's, so maybe it will be at some point 5-5. But that wouldn't have worked anyway because I had already done like the 2 or the 3. And if you're gonna do, and if at that point you're like, oh, I'm gonna do a 5-5, well then you got to do a 5-hour break. So it probably would just be better to finish it out. But here's the problem I have with this whole test. I don't know how they pick the drivers to do the test. I really don't. But I do know this: a lot of people don't know how to split their sleeper. So it really doesn't do you any good. And even there's some companies that won't let drivers split sleepers because people have made a mistake or just they didn't really understand how to do it. And so, as long as people understand how to do it, it's going to be good, right? I think a driver having more latitude is going to be good. Now, I will say this. If somebody's only doing 5 hours in the bunk and they're doing 5 hours of off duty, there's fatigue is always an issue, and the government has always been concerned with fatigue, but there are situations where I'm sure a driver could manage it. And so I do kind of applaud the idea that they're going to try to make things a little bit easier, give people a little more flexibility, a little more latitude, and maybe that makes driving a truck just a little bit easier. But I one thing I would really love to see is that when the FMCSA says, yeah, there's this thing available to drivers, that they would prohibit companies from allowing drivers to use those tools. In other words, the company I just left prohibits the use of yard move or PC. Now, I kind of know why they do PC, but yard move, like I used to have to putt, like when I would deliver, I used to putt around, and it was so funny because this one company that we delivered to, they were like, you guys are spending too much time doing your drop and hooks. It's like, sorry, I'm not going to do a drop and hook on the drive line. I'll do it in yard move, but I'm not going to do it on the drive line. So I'm just going to go off duty and do it. And people say, oh, well, that's illegal. Well, yeah, it is. But my company doesn't want us. It's kind of like when you take away yard move, or even if you take away PC, you're basically saying to drivers, oh, just go ahead and figure out a way to get around it. And it was so funny because one time when I was in the training, when I was going through orientation, the people in the training department were all mad at this driver who quit. And they're like, yeah, you know, he drove all the way back here off duty. It's like, well, you know, he, first of all, he's quitting, so why would he care? But even more importantly, like, if he had PC to drive his empty truck back to, and you can't use PC to drive to your own terminal, but what I'm saying is, if he used PC to drive a long way, parked for a couple of minutes, and then put himself on the drive line, he probably wouldn't have violated it. But I do like that we're able to get more latitude, and hopefully this will benefit everybody, at least people that work for companies that allow you to split your sleeper. But I also think that sometimes these companies don't want to train drivers. That's why they take away PC. That's why they take away yard move. That's why they take away splitting sleepers. They themselves don't want to train people. And in fact, a lot of people in these companies that prohibit this use, they don't even understand how hours of service truly work. Because when I was at Bowman, you know, nobody there seems to know how to, like in dispatch, they were mystified that I would stay out longer than like 8 days at a time. They're like, well, what about your 70 clock? I'm like, well, I'll start recapping at midnight. What? How's that work? Like, it was like it was magic to them or something. Like, they didn't even know how all this stuff works, but they're bossing truck drivers around. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Hope everybody's doing well. You know, I'll see you next time. Talk to you soon. Bye.